Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's WEConnect International webinar. My name is Maggie Berry. I'm the Executive Director for WEConnect International here in Europe, and I'm delighted that you've joined us for today's webinar, Employee Appraisal, an Old Tool in New Clothes. Our presenter today is Anja Schröer. She is the owner of Schröer Consulting, a WEConnect International certified women's business enterprise based in Germany, and they specialise in human resources management, people development, and leadership development. In today's session, Anja is going to be sharing with us how to use employee appraisals to help your companies build the long-term skills you need to succeed, how to help your employees to develop themselves, and how to increase employee morale. Background noise to minimum, participants will all be on mute. So please do use the chat functionality to ask questions that you might have, and there will be time for questions at the end. Anja's probably going to talk for about 40 to 45 minutes, and the session is being recorded, so you will be able to listen back to it again. So Anja, thank you so much for presenting for us. I'm going to pass the floor over to you. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, Maggie. So also, hello from my side. I'm based, as Maggie said, in Germany, women-owned business, and we are a kind of corporation of women who support businesses, medium to big-sized businesses in the field of human resources and leadership development. I myself have been an HR manager in big corporations, mostly international, for many years. And being an HR manager, for me, the webinar topic we have today was always something I was very enthusiastic about on the one hand, and on the other hand, very frustrated because it was not easy to get it going. So now, being a consultant, I think, or I perceive in the world that things are changing about the employee appraisal, and that is what I'm going to talk about in the next 40 to 45 minutes. So I called my webinar an old tool in new clothes because that's exactly what it is. I can see quite a revival in this tool, and we will see what that means in detail. Can you please put the next slide, Maggie? So my agenda will be to talk about how I perceive the change, and it will be interesting to see if the ones of you who have more experience or have experience with it can see the same change, or if you see it different. We can maybe share in the chat function or in the end of my speech. Then I'm going to talk about the goals of the appraisal, which I think have highly changed in the course of the last years. And then what I brought you is the conversation phase model, because I think you need some core competences now to be able to carry out a good appraisal with your employees, a good talk to your employees. And we're going to look into some of these competences in the webinar. One is about building a relation. How do you set up that meeting with the employee? And one is about giving feedback. We will talk about feedback. We will talk about listening and asking questions. And that will be the final part of the webinar. And then in the end, you can ask questions, or we'll ask the questions you put into the chat function. Very good. So maybe next slide, please. So what I put here for you is always the classical appraisal approach, how I found it in the companies years ago, and how I now see and perceive the new way of the employee appraisal. So what I can see is that it goes away from a pure from a measurement of performance to a more coaching approach. So that we don't, like I was in the automotive industry, and we had a big, heavy process 2 or 3 times a year where we were measuring the performance of the employees very strictly in a form where you had to tick off certain boxes and saying if the people are good for the job or not and how the performance is. And I think it was very heavily based on performance. You talked about the goals also the company had, and a very strict process based on performance. What I see now is that it changes to a more coaching approach. What do I mean with coaching approach? Now it's more really looking into the person. It's not so much the process and filling in a kind of form. It's more the person. So 2 people sitting together and achieving a real improvement through coaching. So that you really talk with people on the things they are moved by at the moment, the next step they want to reach in their career, in their job, in job enlargement, and we really focus more on this coaching approach than on measurement of performance. So that's, I think, a big, big change. For me, this change also comes through the new generations, because my perception, or you can also read about it in the new generations, it's more that they come for personal development, so that they give their input for personal development. No, when I'm a little more than 50 years old. When I started working, I put in my engagement, my time to gain money, and was very career oriented, with a lot of hours going into the job to make a career. Now, the way I perceive it, people come for a good coaching. So, like the young person I know, she applied for a company, and a real argument for her to join this one company was that they told her, look, you're going to get a good coaching throughout the time you're here. And there, I think that has changed a lot. So that leads me directly to the next point, objective goals versus personal goals. Former times you had the company goals and were trying to break them down, or you were breaking them down in the employee appraisal to split them up for the employees. This is, I think, still important, but there's now more focus on the personal goals. So where does a person want to develop to? What is the next steps? What will enlarge their view? So this also a big change from the objective goals to more personal goals. So you always used to have more focus on evaluation. And now for me, it's more focus on real conversation. And if I say real conversation, it means that if you have such an appraisal, it needs to, as a manager, adapt to this and think about it. How can you get that level deeper and really start to talk about personal issues and personality and developing the personality? I think this point is easier said than done, because you need a big level of trust to really be able to go on a deep conversation with your employees. But it's not so much the focus on evaluation that in the end you say person is good or not so good or has to improve, but more real on the conversation. The next one is that if you look into new trends, and I know business who changed it already, and if you see the discussion on employee appraisal, former times it was 2 times a year, 3 times, but often it was 2 times, because you said you start up in the year, then you do a midterm review, and you do a final year review, which you can combine with the appraisal for the next year, for the year to come. Now, what you can see is that leaders and employees start to change their systems, or companies start to change their systems more into a little lighter kind of check-ins. That means you talk a lot more often. No, I don't say it's once a month or once 2 weeks, because that, for me, is very highly different to the business. So I think each business, as so often in HR, has got to find their own path, their own way to it. But for me, to have a real development in a person and in a job and in the tasks, it needs to be talking more often. Also, if you really get to talk more often, it won't be that big. You don't put so much energy into it, because if you talk only once a year or twice a year, there's always a lot of energy going into it before. You have to prepare it, you have to look up your notes you took throughout the whole year, and a lot of energy to bring up to start it. And the employees never know what it's all about, and somehow then if it is such a big energy, you tend to look at it like a burden. And that was what always really frustrated me as an HR manager in bigger companies, that the leaders saw it as a burden, and they were saying, okay, now, oh my God, now it's again time for the appraisals. And I could never really understand, why don't they see it as a chance? If you now decide to do it more often, talk more often, I think you get more into a habit of talking, and a habit of talking about not like everyday talking, because then managers say, okay, but we talk to our employees every day. But what I mean here is something different. It means to go one level deeper and really see where the person stands, if he or she is happy or not, and how he or she sees the job. So more often. And I've met a manager just 2 months ago who said, okay, in my leadership role, I spend 70% of my time on leading and only 30% on the operational job, where I thought, okay, that's already quite a message. And he said he would go for an appraisal, like I describe it now. It all works a lot better, because I know the people well, I know where they stand, I can help them immediately, and he has less less time for the operational because he doesn't need it anymore. He sort of makes sure there's a development in his department, and the teamwork goes on a lot better through talking a lot more often. So I think now there's a big span between saying, okay, you talk once a year or every 2 months. And I don't say you need to do it every 2 months, but maybe once a month or once in the quarter or every 6 weeks is a good measure, depending also a little bit on the situation you have with your employees. If you have a lot of young people needing a lot of development, I would think it's necessary more often. If you have people who do the same job every day, you'd maybe say, okay, it's not important so often. But it also reflects to the fact that we want people to develop in organizations. For me personally, I always say, okay, who is working with me will develop. I think it's very important. Also, if you look into change, business are changing very much, so it is important to also support people through the change. Next point is the point on feedback. In former times, always we ask the managers to look for feedback so that the employee gives feedback to the leaders, because leaders normally, that don't get so many feedback in their day-to-day life. Now the feedback is more an integral part, so it's more two-way communication. Where if you talk about the employee and how it can develop, you always look also into how can the relationship between employee and manager develop and what is real feedback to the leader. So there's also there's more focus on feedback to the leader. I think to get a good feedback from your employees, you need to be patient. Patient in the sense that it often needs to ask more than one time. So if you don't get a good feedback in the first meeting, you ask again in the second one. You could then go and say, maybe, please name one thing which can be done better in the work between us. Or what you can also do to get a good feedback is to name a thing where you yourself think you could improve and say, look, I'm working on, with me, it was always being too much ahead of my employees. Do you think I'm too far ahead of you? Can you follow? And then they would give a feedback a little bit more unprompted, but then you also start getting feedback from your employees. And I think it's also a very good process for trust and for improving your own leadership skills if your employees are grown up enough to give you feedback. Then on the next slide, please. Next page, please. The documentation. In former times, there was a lot of emphasis on documentation. As I said, I was in the automotive industry. It was a 6-page document. You had to submit the whole document to the HR, and copies were made, and it was all a bit complex in terms of who keeps the documentation and how do we derive things of it. This, I think, has completely changed into little documentation. I even have customers who don't document at all, where just an email goes to the HR department on people development, on trainings needed. But even some companies leave that out and say, okay, the employee can himself or herself go to the HR department or even organize trainings themselves. So, and many of the companies I'm consulting at the moment, they keep record of the employee appraisals, but only between manager and employee. And the HR department only gets the one page with the agreements. But there's no such thing as many, many pages. Because the emphasis is a lot more on how do you feel at the moment. And having said that, it also changed because the companies tend to more and more do these appraisals for really everybody. And former times in the companies, often it was done for the white-collar stuff and not so much for the blue-collar because it seemed to be too complex to do it for everybody. This way, if you do it a lighter way and an easier way, more on the talking, on the conversation, you can do for everybody. And little documentation, I think, helps to keep the whole system a lot lighter than it has been up to now. Next one is a bit the same. Former times you had very strict specification. Now it's more open guidelines. Normally I have a little set of guidelines, just that the leaders do it a little bit the same way and have some guidelines of how to carry out and what to do. And for the rest, you leave it basically open. And then normally what I do is I train the managers in the companies, because I think it's not easy to do such a new form of appraisal, but it's more training on how to give feedback. And on the conversation phase model we'll see in the next part of the webinar, it's more on that than on the appraisal system, because there's not so much to say if you have small set of guidelines only. This is also a big change. Some companies still want some guidelines for the ISO system, for the certification, yeah, it depends, of course, on the company. Like I said earlier on, in HR, it's never the same for any company, but guidelines are smaller now, not so much, not so heavy than years ago. The next point I mentioned already, not all results are given to the HR department, only the measures mainly are given. So if there's something to do for HR to support, can be done. Pay performance versus online and apps. There are also some apps existing like Loopline or others where you can reflect your feedback and check-in system online, and per app where you don't use paper at all. That's possible for companies who want to do it. I think it's a good idea, but again, it does not apply to every company. I still think it's also okay to do it in paper, but if you want to have it more online-based, more digital, you can use an app for that. Yes, prescribed categories. So having said there's no detailed documentation, it's not so strict. You more get an open conversation where I think you can a lot more find out what moves the employee and what the real issues are than in the very formal process. Because if you do it more often, it gets more informal. So maybe on the next slide, please. That's a little bit of a summary for the first part of the webinar, because the targets of the appraisal with this have changed a little. It's an open exchange about what is positive. So you can ask your employees simply the open question, what did you ask? What did you like last year? What was positive for you? And then, of course, also talking about problems. And I think we can use the word problems here. What can be improved? What would you want to have different? What were things you didn't like so much? Maybe work results you didn't achieve, and what can we do different to improve this? Then you review your cooperation with the employee. That's also a target of the appraisal real review. So there it's important to be open for feedback and criticism of the employees. The main target is to know if the employees feel good in their job, because nowadays it's very important, I think, to know where your people stand. If they like the company or not, if they like their workplace, if they're happy, if they are not too stressed, so to avoid the risk of going into a burnout. And really that's important to the companies, because I think in many countries it's nowadays difficult to find good employees. So that's a very important thing to keep employees in their roles and in your company. This also brings me to one thing where I think leaders' role have changed. I think the role of the leader in one point has changed dramatically, and that is to give some safety or security, I don't know which one is the right word in English, to the employees on their workplace. Because around a lot of things are going on, companies are changing, digitalization and all these topics, and it's important for your own unit, for your team, your company, to give some safety and security so that people can feel well and really perform and really input into your company. Number 5, the building relationship. I think with this kind of appraisal, doing it in a lighter, more consequent, more conversational way, you build a relationship with the employees, which is to me very important in a team. Motivation. Of course, if you can more find out what people really need, you can adjust their jobs or what they do to what really motivates them. That's a big advantage, because then people, of course, will work more engaged and be more happy. And you get that positive feedback and criticism in both directions. So for me, this would be the new way of appraisal and how you can use it best for your company. Small steps, more often, more intense, more focused on personal development, or on the personal side of the development. Yeah, and if you're so close, you'd always find topics to talk about, because you know where people stand at the moment. I don't know, Maggie, are there any questions by now? Because that's now a different topic coming up.
There haven't been any questions come through in the chat box that I've seen, but please, if you do have any questions for Anja, please use the chat functionality and I'll keep an eye open for them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Because before I saw that you were all interested in the more coaching approach, and if you have there more questions, please feel free to put them in the chat function. Okay, then the next slide, please. I call this a conversation phase model. I hope it's a good English phrase. And the idea is to give you a guideline for talking to people. That's not so much only for the employee appraisal, but you can use this really very well if you do an employee appraisal. So you have a little guideline and how you can go through. So the first phase, I think that's very obvious, is the warm-up phase. Then you get a phase with a view of the employee. Then you get a phase, the view of the leader. Then you normally have an agreement and you close the session. And in these phases, you have different targets. You have when you go through. So the target in the warm-up phase, and we start with this one now in the next part of the webinar, is a positive atmosphere and finding a common basis. And I've always put also the core competence. Here for me, the core competence is building a relationship. And it is about how can I start it up? How can I be a good empathic person and go into contact with employees? So if you can go to the next slide, please. We stay with the warm-up phase. So now it's very clear. We all think about how can we create a good atmosphere? How can we do the first sentences? How we can sort of start the conversation nicely? And how can I be fully present? So on the first, I would think it's good if you as a person have your own way of starting up an appraisal, because we always say talk about the weather or the way of a person. How did they manage to come to the meeting? I think you need your own way. No? Like me, I'm not a soccer fan, so I can't open it up with soccer. I need something different to talk about. It also depends on, do you want to serve a coffee? How do you really start this meeting? How do you create a good atmosphere? It's highly dependent on your own style. Just if you take a moment to think about it, how do you actively do it? It's interesting to see if you already found something or if you never thought about it. The second, I think, is the same important. It's the way how you enter mentally in such a meeting. And this point, often people have not reflected up to now, because normally we go into such a meeting with our head full of things. We've got many, many other meetings, other things in our heads, very operational things mostly, and then all of a sudden the expectation is you sit down and listen, be calm, and really be empathic and easy with your employee and go into a deep conversation. So there I would also ask you to think about what can you do to change your mindset in this moment. It's a little bit like mindfulness, to really think about what can I do, maybe breathe, or I don't know, look at a certain picture, or go out and walk some minutes, or just make a gesture with your hands, something out of Qigong or whatever, just to remind your mind and body that now, from that moment on, all the rest is off. You're just concentrated in this moment on the person you're talking to. You don't do anything else. So I think that is very important. I'm a coach also. I do that before I have a coaching. And if you have never thought about it, maybe it's a good idea to think about how can you set your mind right in this moment. Because if not, your mind will wander in the conversation. And maybe you have some ideas on that. If you have an idea on it, it's also good for the chat, maybe. Yeah. How do I start talking? That was what I said, which start fits to me. What is appropriate for the employee in the context? Of course, you don't start with a long asking how was your way or how's the weather if you saw the person the half day. The own attitude is about what is my own attitude, what I talked about. And often it's also interesting if you before explain why the conversation is done, so that you have say, okay, we are here now because I would like to see how you're doing, and because I would want to have a two-way conversation to see how you see the company and your job into it, and I will tell you what I see. And in the end, I would like to have a feedback. And that often gives what I said earlier on, the security, the safety, that people have a safe room and an open room where they can communicate to you really in an open way. And often it's good to explain why. Okay, the next phase in the conversation model is the view of the employee. Can you maybe go back 2 slides? Sorry, Maggie, I forgot that. Yeah, the view of the employee. So here, we go to the view of the leader first. I've got the order in the other way around. Because then, if you want to really give your employee a feedback, in this part of the session, it's more you talking and the employee comments. In the view of the employee, it's the other way around. It's you listening. But in this part of the conversation, it's you giving a feedback to the employee about how do you see the employee? How do you see the person you're sitting in front of? So I thought it would make sense to briefly look into the most important rules for feedback, and I have a little formula then later on for you to apply. So, and it's worth also thinking about it. How do you give good feedback? Because I think it's not so easy to do that, and it needs a bit of training. But if you get the chance, start training as of today after the webinar. So the 5 most important rules for good feedback is, of course, to formulate respectful, that you stay calm and respectful to the employee. The second one, which is very, very important, is to use the I perspective. Because if you say, I think, I watched, I perceive, I have made the observation that you look sad, it's always a good entry into a feedback, because your own reality is your own reality, and you don't pinpoint or finger point to the employee. You use the I perspective, and that's always allowed for you to have a perspective. It's your own reality, and nobody can debate. No? If you sit in a room and say, I feel cold, there's nothing to see with the fact it's cold or not, but it's your own perception. So if you turn around all your feedback using the I perspective, I think you already did a very big step forward into good feedback giver. The next one is be descriptive. Don't evaluate or interpret. You just give a description. You don't so much interpret. You can give a hypothesis, but you more give a description. You can say, yesterday when I saw you coming in, I thought, I had the impression that you are in a bad mood, or that you feel ill, or that you have a problem with me, or something like that. And then you are descriptive. You talk about a concrete situation, and you name the behavior very concretely. And that's interesting, because if you only say, I don't like the way you do it, nobody knows what it's about. Or I think the way you behave is stupid, nobody can do anything with this. No? And an example for this is also, for the next one, to be specific. It's not enough only to say, look, you are unfriendly, but maybe you can also say when it was. No? When was it when you were unfriendly? Or your look is unfriendly, or the way the words you use sound unfriendly, or the voice you have makes an unfriendly impression. So it's very important to be quite specific in the feedback. And if I say wanted, the feedback is wanted. It is about reflecting that you can give a feedback, but the person doesn't have to receive it. You can give it, but the person is free to accept it or not. Same applies to you. If you get a feedback from someone, you can yourself decide if you accept it or not. So you're not forced to accept it. Yes, and the next one is what I said: concrete and practicable, better related to behavior. Don't give any feedback to things which the other person can't change. A stupid example is like, I think your nose is too big. That's no use, because the other person can't change that fact. So it's more about behavior, that you really name the behavior. Now, if you say, I had the impression you made a very unfriendly entry or welcome to another person, specifically tell them what you think. Yeah, and all that I put in a 3-step approach for feedback. It's a bit translated from the German, so the formula in German, it's a nicer sequence of words. I still need to work on this a little. So the first one is reflecting on the 5 most important rules. It's a perception. What have I perceived? What happened? What exactly happened? So first, name what happened. And there you can give examples, facts, things you observed, and specific situations. Very important that first you talk about what you observed. The second one, sorry, Maggie, it's on the next slide. Yes, the first I talked about was the perception, that you talk about really what you have experienced, what happened. And there you go with examples, facts, observations, specific situations. The next one is the impact. What is the effect for me? What feeling does it trigger in me? How do I feel about? Which behavior does it trigger in me? So like saying, if you have this bad behavior, if you're unfriendly, I feel disappointed. And there you can name really your own feelings. It's often a question I get in organizations: can we talk about our feelings? Of course, because the feelings belong to us, and I think it's good here to name your personal feeling, and you're still in the I message. I feel, I perceive, I think. And it's important for the other to understand what the impact is of the behavior. The last one is a wish. So you can then ask, tell the other person what you wish for a behavior instead, or you can give a proposal, or if you can scale this wish a little bit. So if you are really into a tough discussion on a performance issue, you can say, as of tomorrow, I want this changed. No? Or you can say, my proposal would be, or I would wish you to do instead. So you can have it more strict or more easy, depending on the situation. But this 3-step formula you can always use for feedback. You can even use it in the private setting. Try it out. Just try it. At first, it feels a bit strange to give feedback this way, but when you train it a bit, it comes quite natural, and you will see that your world will change with that way of feedback, especially with employees, because then they can accept it. And the main thing with feedback is to talk it in a way that the other person can accept and work with it. That's also the tip. If you yourself get a feedback from another person, don't defend yourself. Wait, think about it. Think about, can I accept it, the feedback? Think about if you still have questions, ask the questions, but then wait and see the next day or the day after next if you want to change something for yourself or not. So it's never good to defend the feedback and say, this was because I could not do different. That's not a good idea. So maybe if you take this formula and try out, would be a good idea. Yeah, and then the next slide, please. The active listening, that's something you need in the conversation phase model, the view of the employee, because here it's important to let the employee talk. And that is something me as an HR manager, I've been in so many situations and contexts where managers and leaders could not shut up, so to say. Like in interviews where managers talk 50 minutes of 1 hour. Here in this phase, that's not a good idea, because you want the employees to think. You want them to talk about what they think, how they feel, and you want get their brain activated through your listening and asking question skills. And with the listening, it's quite interesting. Also something you can maybe watch in the next days. There are different levels of listening, and the first level you need to get to is just listen. That means normally if we listen to somebody, we are always already about to formulate an answer. I don't know if you can see that in your own behavior. If you've watched that in meetings, often we listen only with the idea which clever answer we can give to the person talking. If we do that, we are not really listening anymore, because we already know what the person says. Yeah, we listen with the aim. We already know what the person says, and we think about our next best answer. So the first level to achieve in terms of listening skills is to be aware of this, to think about this, and to push it aside, and to really try, even if it's very hard sometimes. I'm training this for many years. There's still people I can't properly listen to without my thoughts wandering. But for me, that's the first stage of listening skills, that you really try out to listen completely and only to what the person says. So what I put here, to the active listening, that's if you should describe a person who's listening well, a good listener, that's the attributes you would give to this person. I put a dog because I think the dogs are good listeners, so I thought this picture would fit well. The first one is hear the other one out. So let the other person finish their thought. Don't interrupt with what you already have to say. Just don't do that. Wait until the person finalizes talking. It's sometimes a bit difficult with people who talk and talk and talk. There, you can sometimes stop, because if they don't stop talking at all, you might ask for permission to stop them in between, or you might give them a meta feedback with the feedback formula, so that you get an allowance to interrupt. But that's only with the persons who talk a lot. Then you can, of course, confirm. With active listening, you can confirm verbal and non-verbal. Verbal means that you say like, okay, and that's what's missing in a webinar, that you say, okay, I understood you, and you ask questions in between. Non-verbal means that you look at the person. Very important to keep eye contact if somebody's talking, and that you reconfirm by your body language. A good idea in listening is summarize what you heard, so that you say, did I understand right? What you really want is this and this and this, because often then you still find differences in the way the person said and you understood. And if it's really important things that occur within an employee appraisal, I would do that. I would always summarize, did I understand right, this and this and this. Yeah. Or you can let the other repeat, for example, what you ask them to do. And you will be very astonished, of course, of what comes out on the different levels of communication. It's a good method of adjusting communication and being sure both parties understand the right way. The next one I talked about, listening without thinking about the answer. And please try it out. The next one is opening up and thinking and feeling for the other views. That's again a thing of the mindset, like the mindset of that you need to change when you go into an appraisal. It's like opening, we say a holy, a sacred space for the other. So you really open from internally. You think about opening you and the space in thinking and feeling for the other views, for the other's view. So you don't limit yourself by your own view, but you really think about opening up your thinking and feeling so that you can fully get what the other person is talking about, what the other person is feeling and thinking. So that's some hints about how you can improve your active listening skills. I think that's very, very important. So the last thing I was going to talk about is the asking questions. You also need this for the view of the employee, because then if you have a person who doesn't talk so much, or you want to go to some really specific topics, it's a good idea to ask questions. And in my coaching education, I was very skeptic about questions. I was not able really to ask good questions, so I dived deep into it, and I think it's a wonderful tool to lead a conversation and to really find out more about people. So I just put the 3 topics here. The one who asks leads. The one who asks the question is leading the conversation. Earlier on, I heard about it, but I think I didn't fully embrace this view. It is true. If you ask good questions, you're leading the conversation, because very often it's very clever to find out what the other person thinks, and then you can comment and reflect. And of course, to find out something, what other people think or feel, it's important to ask open questions. So you open up and you can ask questions like why, or can you please describe me? Now, if you ask the question, do you feel well in your department? People will say yes or no. But if you ask, can you please tell me the 3 points you really liked in your work in the last year? Can you tell me the 3 points in your work you're most proud of? Then you get people to talk. So a good question is always a question where other people cannot simply answer with yes or no. And if you ask a real good question, the other person will say, this is a very good question. Let me think about it for a moment. And then, if you really ask a good question, there's one important thing, which is again the listening. Then you make a pause. You wait and give the other person the room to answer. Because if you ask a real good question, the answer might take time. It might even take 1, 2, 3 minutes until the other person has formulated their answer. And this is hard, because breaks in a conversation are always tough to sustain, tough to the one who is leading the conversation. It's very tough to make these breaks and to feel well in the breaks. But it is important, if you ask a good question, to give the other person the room. And there's one more thing about questions. If you ask the closed questions and the person just said yes or no, it's not a problem. As long as you recognize, then you simply ask the next open question, and you can open up the conversation again with the next open question. So what you can very well do, and you find very much information about that in the internet, is to yourself create a little tool set of good questions. I call it the art of asking good questions. Questions you really like. So you can go through there. As I said, in the internet, you'll find a lot. Just write down the 5, 6, 7, 8 good questions you really like. Those you then ask in your interview. Yes, that is about the asking good questions. So it takes time until you got it and you're really able to always ask open questions, but it's worth the effort to go into it and train this a lot. Yeah, then going back to the conversation phase model, in the end, afterwards, you do an agreement with the employees. Can you maybe go back on slide 6, please, Maggie, for the last 2 phases shortly? Yes, then you do an agreement, and there it's often good to use the action plan technique that you really write down what are you going to do, what is the employee going to do, and by when. It's straightforward, but often not done. And I think there it's good. Me personally, I think it's good to have something written, because if you put it in writing, you have it black on white, nobody in the end can say we didn't talk about it. And it's an agreement here. You together agree what happens until the next appraisal, and then you see did it work out or not. And then, of course, you do a close of the session. You maybe ask an open question. What would you wish different? What did you think was good in the meeting? And then you have a positive close of the session, and you can agree the next meeting, which is hopefully after this webinar, not too long to go from there. Yeah, that was about my reflections on the appraisal. Yes. I don't know if you have questions, maybe some feedback on what you think. How to handle this.
Thank you so much. That's great. You've covered a lot in a very short amount of time. I know one question that's come in from Mirta on the chat box. I don't know if you can see that yourself, but she's asking about the link between, I guess, appraisals and then potential bonus payments. And she's asked a question whether maybe bonus payments aren't being paid to non-staff, or is there any kind of, are people moving away from that kind of model of kind of measuring results and then that's your bonus is aligned to? So I don't know if there's anything you could share around you know, this new form of appraisal and how it might link to maybe performance payments. I don't.
Yes, it's probably performance pay. It's a very interesting question. Also, do you link it to the salaries paid and salary increases? My clear advice is no, but this I'm just thinking it may be a bit cultural. So in Germany it was always linked, but I would clearly advise not to do it. And many of my clients have problem with that, so I put it in the policy. I think if you want to talk about salary or bonus system, I would do it offline. This system I would completely split. If you have a bonus system, I would not link it into this way. Maybe link it in the 1 year appraisal and do the check-ins additionally. Yeah, that would be my answer, but that might apply more to Europe. I'm not sure.
Okay, great. Thank you. I mean, I have a couple of points that I've noted down myself, but please, if anybody on the call, if you do have any questions for Anja, please do use the chat box to ask them. I really liked your idea of kind of shifting the view of an appraisal as a burden as to being an opportunity. I really like that, to have a conversation, but a different conversation from the one that you have on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely.
You touched on it at the beginning, as well as it being about feedback from the employee around what's going well with them. You touched very briefly on asking them for feedback about the employer's way of working or how they're getting on with that. And do you have any advice around a good way to ask for feedback from, say, the team leader or the employer for feedback on how they're working from the employee's perspective? Like, how do you ask the employee feedback about yourself?
I think it applies the same way. You can start with asking an open question, like, is there anything I can improve in the way of leadership? If you don't get an answer, you try again. And then you can intensify by asking about something you work on. Like, normally you also have the appraisals and there's things you work on, and you can directly ask for this. Like, do you think, I'm working on the topic of communication with my team. Do you think I can improve on direct communication? And what do you think I can improve? So you make it more easy for employees to go over this first hurdle. And so you make it more easy to get into talking about it. But it takes a bit of time.
Yeah. And then
don't give up.
No, and then my second question, which you partly answered, was where would you say is a source of good questions to ask during an appraisal? And then you said I'd written that down as one of the questions, and then you said, oh, there's you can look online and you create your own tool set. Are there any websites or I don't know, websites that you would recommend to try and find some of those good questions? Because I think very much knowing what questions you're going to ask, being prepared, very helpful.
Yes.
And winging it. But are there any good resources you would point people to?
I had one, but normally maybe they're more in German. But I think it was called The art of the question master. I have to look it up. I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm sorry. But it's a good point. I should have a reference for that. I don't have at the moment.
Yeah.
Not in English.
No, well, no, I mean, it doesn't. I mean, it's. I think really the idea around crafting the questions
Yeah.
and want to ask and find out. I mean,
And I have a list myself, but it was in German, and I didn't have the time to translate. But I
oh,
could.
there you go.
Yeah.
No, that's fine. I just wondered.
Yes.
Okay. Are there any more questions from people on the call around anything that they'd like to ask Anja around the appraisal model, or around? I guess really it's around asking and giving feedback, because being able to make sure that your staff aren't feel that it's all a constructive conversation. But if you do have any questions, please do use the chat function to ask them. I think you mentioned that maybe doing an appraisal maybe a couple of times a year. Is that the right kind of time frame, or is it? I would have said normally an appraisal would be an annual thing, but is that maybe the older model?
Yeah, for me it's a little bit the older model, but it's not bad in itself. I think it's good to have maybe a big appraisal if you have this system in the companies and you can't just throw it away, or you don't want to throw it away and do a new one. You just add the shorter check-ins on top. Yeah.
Okay.
But I think it's good to have the big one once a year, which takes then also longer. Often it takes 2 hours, and then have a shorter to follow up.
Lovely. Okay. So I'm not seeing any questions come through, but if people did want to follow up with you, if they wanted to find out more, are you happy for people to get in touch with you? Is this a service that you might be able to provide to some of the other businesses around, setting up or modernizing, shall we say, their appraisal systems?
Yes, absolutely. This I do very often, and it's, as I said, always very individual, and it depends on commitment, and often on training of the board and the owners, and then see how do they want to implement, and then we tailor-made the systems for the company. There's no one solution, I think, to this.
Indeed.
Very individualized, like HR always is, I think.
And then just one final question: that did you approach this whether the appraisal was face-to-face or virtual? So I know even for our WEConnect International team, we're very virtual. We're not in the same location. We're not always together. Could you approach appraisals in the same way, even if they were not in-person meetings?
Yes, you can. But that you can. I would still advise that it's good to know each other in person first, but that's maybe because I'm a little more than 50 years old, and I know that younger people even think it's personal if they do it via Skype or so on. I think it's not a problem. I think a picture is good that you see the other reactions, but it's possible via Skype or another platform. Yes.
Okay. And then Kapina's asked a question about, well, how often should you have appraisals? And you're saying that's flexible, but what is your opinion of group appraisals?
Group appraisals? You mean in a whole group? Okay. I don't think if I would do that, because I think it's good to give praise, so positive feedback in a group, but for the real criticism, which can get very personal, or the tips you give to people to improve, it's better to do it one-on-one, I would say. But you can still have, of course, a team session, but then it's more about talking on the team behavior and how is the team doing, and not so much with the focus on one individual. If it's really focused on one individual, I would even say it's good if it's one-on-one and not have the next level boss or someone in the room. It's better to, I think.
Fair enough. No, I can understand. Super. Well, I've certainly learned a lot from this around, and I've worked in environments where we've had very formal appraisals, environments where it's very informal, where there's really not very much. But as I said, I really liked your idea of shifting it from feeling like, oh, it's just something that's got to be done, to actually being a really useful tool in kind of the in development for everybody across the team, and getting into that habit of talking, but more in depth, kind of going under, delving a bit deeper than you would do on a general day-to-day. With a general day-to-day.
And then I think you got it, you made it when the employees start asking for it. then you are there. And we do that in my company, and the people are really asking for it. Also, the employees like the appraisal because they see an own development. Yeah. So it's a win-win, I think, for everybody.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, Anja, thank you so much. We will be sharing your slides so people can look again at the model. And if you want to find out more, then I will be sharing Anja's contact details so that you can get in touch with her directly. But thank you very much for everybody who's dialed in today, and thank you to anybody who's listening to the recording of this. And Anja, a big thank you to you from the WEConnect International team for presenting and for sharing your expertise with us. This has been super interesting, and I hope super helpful for everybody who's been able to listen. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and I hope I could motivate you all a little to do more appraisals, more talking, more in depth.
Super. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye bye.